Greetings. I'm Jonathan Lee Walton. I'm the Dean of the Divinity School here at Wake Forest University and the Dean of Wake Chapel. And let me begin with my profound appreciation to you, the people of Westminster Presbyterian Church, and your pastor, Reverend Ben Dorr. I'm so sorry that this pandemic has created this social distance between us. But I do want to be clear about one thing, and that is that social distancing is a public health term and is somewhat of a misnomer. We're physically distanced, even as we attempt to maintain both a social and spiritual connection with one another. And so I'm glad that the tools of advanced technologies have allowed me to share with you even in this manner, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you virtually over Zoom as well. I'd also like to thank you for your support of Wake Forest University School of Divinity. Here at Wake Divinity, we are committed to fostering agents of justice, reconciliation, and compassion. We're developing architects of hope, equity, and healing. So Westminster, by supporting us, you're supporting your congregation and so many others like it. To be sure, we are here, we're Baptist in tradition, but we're ecumenical in constitution and in outlook. As one with Methodist and Baptist roots out of Raleigh and Atlanta, respectively, yet trained in the Reformed tradition at your pastor's alma mater of Princeton Theological Seminary, I know the value and gift of denominational diversity. But whether Baptist, Methodist, Episcopal, or Presbyterian, there's one lesson that I've learned and I so believe to be true. And it's only what we do for those on the margins of society that really matters. That's our call as followers of Christ. That is my Christian commitment. And this is why I consider it such a privilege to now serve as dean of this Divinity School here at Wake Forest, and an honor to fellowship with communities of faith like yours at Westminster Presbyterian. Because with your prayers and support, it might just be that your next pastor or administrator might be in our classrooms right now. So you again are supporting your own interests in supporting us, because you're helping us to develop a thoughtful, learned ministry committed to doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly together before our God. Now today's scripture is found in Mark chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 28 through 31. So one of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Beloved community, divided society. My friends, in his classic collection of essays, The Common Man, Gilbert Keith Chesterton makes a bold declaration. "If I had one sermon to preach," he says, "it would be a sermon against pride. I am convinced," contended the towering English intellect, "that all evil began with some attempt at superiority. A moment when the very skies were cracked like a mirror because there was a sneer in heaven." Pride. What an interesting and instructive point. G.K. Chesterton is not alone. Prominent, though culturally privileged theologians often place pride atop their list of sins animating destruction. Pride, what Friedrich Nietzsche calls will to power. Pride, what Reinhold Niebuhr refers to as the deification of the self. And pride, When viewed as a patriarchal concept, it's that which too often pushes women into what many feminist theologians have called the sin of hiding themselves behind male authority and domestic dominance. But however we define it, there is empirical evidence that a deranged and deluded sense of self, an egotistically driven will to power, an inflated conception of one's value in relation to another is the source of so much evil and suffering in our world. Consider the ways that the presidency of Donald J. Trump came to a violent crescendo on January 6, 2021. What a sad, if not surprising, scene. I say unsurprising because of what I know to be true of American history. There's nothing new about anti-democratic mob attempting to exert its violent will to deprive the constitutionally protected rights of others. Walk back in history with me, Westminster. Recall the American Party, also known as the Know-Nothings. They terrorized Irish and German immigrants throughout the mid-19th century. They instigated deadly riots across the country in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston. Remember the dismantling of Reconstruction. It was here that Southern Democrats overthrew multiracial state and local governments in the final 2 decades of the 19th century. Filmmaker D.W. Griffith valorized these white supremacist insurgencies in what many consider to be the first popular blockbuster film in America, The Birth of a Nation. And don't forget the violent repression of ordinary citizens in this country throughout the 1960s. There was Bloody Sunday atop Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. Alabama law enforcement and deputized citizens beat nonviolent protesters like John Lewis and Amelia Boynton. Why? For daring to seek the right to vote. Each of these events speaks to the limited notion and precarious nature of freedom that's always hamstrung American democracy. And even today, whether it's the right or the cultural left, one might argue that pride is at the root of class and cultural hierarchies in America. What Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel calls the tyranny of marriage. Oh, we use our varying privileges, whether it's our skin color, our gender, our ethnicity, our sexuality, our occupations, our pedigree, our alma maters, or even our region of birth, to assert that we're self-made individuals. Oh, not that we didn't work hard. I know I've worked hard. I'm sure you've worked hard. But often, let's be honest, we obscure our privileges to make it seem that we deserve every benefit. And those people over there somehow deserve their misery. So we obscure injustice and we render gross inequality as somehow God ordained. And as my father used to tell me, you got to always understand, son, that just because you ended up on third base doesn't mean that you hit a triple. But as we celebrate this weekend what would have been Martin Luther King Jr.'s 92nd birthday, I believe that all of us in our nation right now have something to learn from his moral philosophy. Following the teachings of Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr. believed our text today. He believed that the greatest 2 commandments were one. This is to say, to love God with all one's heart, soul, and mind, and then love your neighbor as oneself. But the 2, however, can never be separated. For to love God is to love our neighbor. For how can we profess to love a God who we've never ever seen and not love the ones whom we walk beside each and every day? Thus, In the words of Benjamin Elijah Mays, that great educator and native of South Carolina, the love of God and the love of humanity is one love. Yet King was also clear to articulate the type of love to which he was referring. He believed that the Greeks helped us in this regard because the Greeks had three words for love: eros, or romantic feeling. This is where we get the term erotic. Philia, or mutual affection, like sibling love. Think of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And then, of course, there's agape. And this disinterested concern for the other, this is the highest form of love. It necessitates that I love you for no other reason than you're a fellow child of God, made in God's image. So God commands that you and I love one another, that we treat one another with mutual concern, honor, and respect, even in the case where we don't necessarily like one another. Oh, you can feel free to think that I'm foolish, that I'm immature, that I'm irrational, that some of my views are retrograde. Hey, you might be right. But you and I are still called to love one another or act charitably toward one another. Why? Because we have reasoned that we're both made in the imago Dei, or the image of God. Oh, Martin Luther King Jr., like Jesus, we just can't write them off as impractical idealists. They weren't naive optimists. In fact, King understood better than most the power of evil and the prevalence of injustice. But in a 1957 sermon before the congregation of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, King offered three practical strategies and benefits of loving our neighbor. First, it begins with self-examination. In order to view one another as fundamentally flawed, tragic creatures who possess the capacity for beauty and an infinity toward catastrophe, we must take stock of our own lives. Before we get to canceling folk, we got to do a self-inventory. Consider all the times that your ego overpowered your altruism, all the times that your greed overpowered your generosity, and all the times that you were less than your best self, and what you thought was your best self turned out to be petty and small in comparison to who you are right now. Well, the bottom line is this: within the best of us, there's some evil, and within the worst of us, there's some good. And we have to realize the second, King taught that we should always attempt to defeat injustice, not individuals. Related to the previous point, all of us carry baggage of bias and bigotry. It's impossible to live in America and not be informed by the logic of white, male, and class supremacy. We privilege whiteness, yes. We privilege maleness, yes. We privilege those with money, absolutely. It's the cultural air we breathe. Thus, our aim is to defeat prejudice and ignorance with the weapons of compassion and understanding. And by doing so, we aim to overcome the injustice while inviting individuals into right relationship, what King, like Howard Thurman before him, referred to as beloved community. Now, I can hear somebody thinking to themselves, well, what if people don't want to be in right relationship? Some people prefer prejudice and ignorance over compassion and understanding. Fine. This might be true. I've definitely encountered such people in my life. But King offers a third and final practical strategy here. It comes in the form of a parable. He once told the story of riding in the car with his younger brother, A.D. They were heading from Atlanta to Chattanooga, Tennessee. On the dark 2-lane highway, heading through the mountains of North Georgia, other drivers that night seemed to be particularly discourteous. They kept their bright lights on as the King brothers' car confronted them along the opposite lane. This caused AD to declare, I know what I'm going to do. The next car that comes along and refuses to dim their lights, I'm going to blast my bright lights back at them. Martin replied, don't do that. For if you blind us and them, then it's going to lead to death and destruction along this road. Somebody has to have some good sense along this highway. Somebody must have the sense to dim the lights. And this is what I want to leave with you, Westminster Presbyterian. Fire cannot extinguish fire, nor can hate vanquish hate. You and I cannot combat the bright lights of intolerance with a brighter light of cancellation or humiliation. Somebody sooner or later has to dim the light. Somebody has to repay ignorance with compassion and egoism with understanding. So it might as well be you. It might as well be me. As a nation, it might be time for us all to dim the lights. Understanding that the love of God and the love of one another is one love.